You heard what was said, right? The Prime Minister calling her the greatest peacetime Prime Minister, but yet she's been described as being loved and loathed. Why?
Because her legacy can be divided, in a sense, between her successes on the foreign policy front, which were considerable. Her and Ronald Reagan engaged Mikhail Gorbachev, and ultimately in 1989 the Berlin Wall came down, and so did the Soviet Union. She was also very effective in 1982 when the Argentinians planted an Argentinian flag on the Falkland Islands, a territory owned, as it were, by Great Britain, and she sent the naval task force and military over, and that was a successful campaign. A year later, she won a landslide victory. So in foreign policy terms, she was incredibly effective. But domestically, she was an incredibly divisive figure. She began and came into office with so much in disarray in Britain. We had major strikes. It was known as the Winter of Discontent, that January, February of 1979. But she set about resolving the problem, destroying labour unions, and then unregulating, deregulating financial markets. And it was all based on her view that she did not believe in a cohesive community society, if you like, and she once said, there is no such thing as society. There are individual men and women and their families, and that was her salient view. But actually, during the 1980s, there were the miners' strikes and the rioting that went as she attempted and successfully disbanded the mining unions and ended up denationalizing the mining industry. Then there were huge race riots throughout Britain through a heavy form of policing that appeared to target urban communities, one of which I lived in. So it was a period of immense conflict domestically and yet apparent success in terms of foreign affairs.
Mark, let's go back to that time, 1979. We'll listen to a little bit of sound here from Margaret Thatcher. Take a listen.
Where there is discord, may we bring harmony. Where there is error, may we bring truth. Where there is doubt, may we bring faith. And where there is despair, may we bring hope.
So Margaret Thatcher in the 1970s through the 1980s, many quotes that we can pull from, that she distilled some very difficult times and environments down to a simple phrase.
Well, she's quoting the great, I think, is it Thomas Aquinas whose those words are? I can't remember. But yeah, I mean, that was when she actually was elected. In reality, the domestic circumstances in Britain were very difficult. For the first 3 years, inflation went up. In 1981, her poll rating was something like 25%, which was the lowest up to that point for a British Prime Minister. Slowly, things began to improve. But then, of course, we had the great debate about Europe, and she was extremely antagonistic towards any kind of single European Union.
Well known in the United States in the 80s here in the United States, and you could not talk about Ronald Reagan without talking about Margaret Thatcher, and she has left a mark on American conservatism. Describe that.
Well, it's interesting because I think in listening to many of the political pundits talking about Margaret Thatcher from the American perspective, they speak of her iron resolve, tremendous, and of course the historic nature of her achievement, the first woman to become Prime Minister. Whatever she did thereafter, nobody was ever going to be able to change that fact. It was remarkable. And yet, the reality of living in Britain during that period was not the one that I keep hearing suggested by many people. And of course, remember this, Richard, when she had to leave power, she was tossed out by her own party because she introduced a flat tax for local costs and expenses, which meant that someone who was a duke in England and held a major title would pay exactly the same amount as a sanitation worker, what we would call a dustman. And there was such uproar that there were riots, and as a result of that, her own party told her she had to go.
Which is even being debated here in the United States, the idea of a flat tax.
Well, you can hear people like Eric Cantor already issuing statements that are eulogizing her. I suspect that if he were to look at the actual details of her leadership and premiership, he wouldn't have such a rose-tinted view of her performance as Prime Minister.
Pleasure having you here, Martin Bashir. Thank you.